When you are invested in something that you realize is world-changing and you have a position in it, you should not sell your entire position based on some event or local timing or something like that. When you have one of those investments, you want to hold onto it for dear life. The playbook is have concentrated positions in things in which you believe will change the world and hold them effectively forever. If you look at these attributes that make for good money, divisibility, portability, fungibility, scarcity, and there are some other ones that I list in my article, Bitcoin excels at all of these. I think Bitcoin still has 100x in it. So we've only seen 1% of the growth that Bitcoin is going to have. The other 99x, to get us to the rest of Bitcoin's potential is still in the future. So it's still such an early story.
All right. So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Vijay Boyapati on the show. Vijay, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Stefan.
Of course. So where I'd love to get the podcast started today, when I was doing, research for the podcast, something that, stood out to me about your background and not just your Bitcoin journey, but your life journey, let's say, was your early experience at Google. Working there in the early 2000s, I think it must have been a much different environment than we know Google today and understand Google today. So I'd love to kind of start there and just hear a bit about that experience and what that was like working for Google in the early 2000s.
Yeah, so it was a much smaller company. There was a few hundred employees, and we were all in one building that was called the Googleplex. And there was a cafeteria where they gave free lunch every day. And it was a great sort of social experience because you would sit and have lunch with anyone at the company, and whether that was the co-founders like Larry and Sergey, or other engineers or people in the sales department, everyone would mix. So it has very egalitarian feeling to it. And one story I like to tell that I think was really important in my life journey was that when I was offered a job at Google, I also had another job offer at Yahoo, which was the preeminent internet company at the time, had the highest valuation, was considered very, financially powerful. And Google was just a small startup. And Yahoo had offered me a lot more money than Google, just in terms of salary. And, just recently having come out of college, I mean, that looked like a big deal to me, right? Like, wow, this is enough money to buy an extra car every year. And I really struggled with the decision. And I asked a friend of mine who used to be a professor professor of mathematics at the University of Toronto. And he gave me some advice that really changed my life. And I like to share it with people, which is the only rational point of having money is if it can bring you happiness. So if you can work at a job or do something that makes you happy, that's worth a lot of money. And that, when he told me that, it made the decision really easy. It was obvious that Google would be a place where I'd be much happier. The people were so smart and so engaged and so passionate about what they were doing. And Yahoo felt very corporate. Like it kind of, when I sort of walked around the offices and spoke to people who were working there, it felt like working at a bank or something like that. But Google felt like, it had this kind of pirate ship mentality, like we're going to take over the world. We're small and people don't realize, how big this opportunity is, but we're going to take over the world. And it was so obvious once I got that piece of advice that I should join Google. And, ultimately it worked out financially as well. And I think that's true in a lot of cases where people make the decision to do what makes them happy, and then it works out financially because they're so engaged, they're so passionate about what they're doing, they want to work hard. And it doesn't even feel like work. It feels like something that they would do, without any outside pressure. So that's really the reason I ended up at Google. And then, I worked on various things. The first thing I worked on when I was at Google was the AdWords system, which is it's kind of interesting. It was incredibly important to Google's success and how Google made money, and they made some really important innovations in how ads worked in terms of targeting relevance. So making sure that the ads you see were relevant to what you were searching for. And it sounds crazy, but before that, Yahoo was showing ads just based on the amount that an advertiser was willing to pay. It had there was no connection to what you were searching for. And so if someone like Coca-Cola came in and let's say I was searching for, I don't know, contact lenses. I wear contact lenses, and suddenly there's an ad for Coca-Cola. I don't care about that. That's not where my mind is. I'm not thinking about that. Whereas Google had the insight, well, why don't we show an ad not just by the price, but the price multiplied by the click-through, which is the likelihood that someone is going to click on the ad because it's relevant to what they're searching for. And actually, that insight was not only good for quality, it massively increased revenue because people started clicking on ads that they wanted to click on. And so the return to the advertiser was like much, much higher. And so it aligned incentives, and it really was, the fuel for the rocket ship that Google became over the next decade, and what helped it grow into such a massive company. And then I worked on various other projects, but the thing I worked on most was Google News, which is a product to gather the news from all the different news sources around the world. So when you're looking for stories, you can get multiple perspectives on the same story. And that's something that I was really passionate about because I had done my undergraduate thesis on using machine learning to classify and organize news stories. And so it was cool for me to work on that project and use some of the ideas that I had done when I was in college and take them into industry.
Yeah, I really appreciate that story, and I think it's super interesting. And I love what you also said there, choosing the path that you feel feels better for you in terms of where you think you will be happier over money. And especially, at the time, obviously now we see how it played out in the whole Google versus Yahoo sprint, but you obviously also made the right decision there. And I think that's a very, very important point that you make. And I think for a lot of people, it's very important to understand that. What I'm also curious about is, being at Google in the early 2000s, it's not, as we know, Google, 25 years later. And I'm sure that there was also some key lessons that you took from there and that also have parallels to Bitcoin. And the reason kind of I'm going here is because I think, like Google in the early 2000s, well, Bitcoin is in kind of that similar phase, right, in terms of adoption. But I'm curious, from when you were at Google, what were maybe some of the key lessons that you learned in terms of like just an overall, I don't know if I want to say tech adoption, or you could even just generalize it to maybe some of the key things that you took away from your experience there.
Well, one takeaway I have, it's on the investment side actually, was that when you are invested in something that you realize is world changing and you have a position in it, you should not sell your entire position based on, some event or local timing or something like that. And I'll be specific here. I got a bunch of Google shares as an employee of Google, and that those did really well. And then in the housing collapse, the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, I saw that coming. I had studied economics and I understood that there was a huge economic bubble that had formed and that it was going to burst and that it would have huge impact on the economy. And so I was like, this is coming. I'm going to sell all my Google shares. And I did. I sold all of them. And it turned out to be great timing locally. Google dropped, I think, I think 70 or 80%. I mean, it dropped a huge amount. Oh, Sorry, my phone is
special.
I don't know why my phone just started talking. This is another thing Google's doing. It's doing artificial intelligence and it's listening to me and it's like providing an answer to something it thinks I asked. But so sorry to get back to my to get back to my point. So it seemed like great timing at the time. I avoided a drawdown of 70% on Google stock and on my net worth because most of my assets were in Google. So I felt really smart. I was like, yes, I timed this perfectly. But I never got back into Google. And from that point, Google has gone up, I think 20 or 30x, like massively. So I lost an enormous opportunity by being so focused on a local event and the timing of that, that I missed the big picture, which is Google is a company that is changing the world in a very dramatic way. And it's when you have one of those investments, you want to hold onto it for dear life. You just don't want to let go. And I honestly believe Bitcoin is the same kind of thing. And so one of the things that helped me was that was a painful lesson. Like over the years, I look back and I was like, oh man, like I thought I was smart at the time selling all those Google shares, but it was incredibly dumb actually. But that lesson helped me with Bitcoin because Bitcoin has gone through even bigger drawdowns. It's had a night since I got interested in it. It's had a 90% drawdown, an 80% drawdown, I think a 70, and it's had some very, very large drawdowns. But I knew that Bitcoin, or at least I felt that Bitcoin was this world-changing technology, revolutionary technology. And so I was able to weather the pain of those drawdowns, knowing that trying to time it in the moment and trying to sell and then maybe try and get back in is incredibly difficult. Very few people are capable of doing that. And it's better and it's simpler, and you will outperform the vast majority of people to just do the simplest thing, which is you have a position and just sit on it. Or, maybe if you, have the conviction, accumulate more over time. But this is the way that people who become enormously wealthy become wealthy. It's a combination of having a concentrated position in something that they have enormous conviction in, enough conviction that they can go through the ups and downs. So you think about people like Bill Gates and Larry and Sergey at Google, Mark Zuckerberg or Warren Buffett. It's all they're doing is holding concentrated positions in stuff that they really have a strong belief in. And usually it's their company, right? They built the company, and the reason they have conviction in it is because it's the thing that they built. But there are investors out there too who have done really well, people like Warren Buffett, and really the playbook is have concentrated positions in things in which you believe will change the world and hold them effectively forever.
I love that. I think that's incredible, and I think that's a perfect synopsis also of kind of a great way also to view investing in Bitcoin, because I think as you mentioned, Bitcoin is incredibly volatile. It goes down 70-80% regularly, and I've had a lot of Bitcoiners on the show, and a regular towards the end of the show I always ask a bit for advice for newcomers, and I would say 90% of the time, it's something around build conviction, do the research, do the work to understand how Bitcoin works and how it will affect the future. And I think that's such an important part, because if you don't have that, it's kind of like you said, you kind of miss out on, or you might sell into that 70%, or even if you sell early before it drops, like you kind of had with Google, where initially you thought, oh, great, I avoided this, 70% crash, to then see it go back up 20, 30 X over a certain amount of time can also be incredibly painful. So I think that story from Google and how it also has impacted your Bitcoin journey, I think is very powerful. And I'd love to get to that moment when you discovered Bitcoin. So I know that after you worked at Google, you actually campaigned with Ron Paul a bit, right? For like behind kind of a libertarianism movement, if that's correct.
Yeah. Yeah, and this ties into Bitcoin, but I'll go back just a little bit and connect the Ron Paul thing. So when I was working at Google, I really didn't have any political ideology at all. And then I came across some folks working at Google who were libertarians, and one of my really good friends, introduced me to some people, some thinkers that I had never heard of before. One of them was Ayn Rand, and one of them was Milton Friedman. And my friend gave me, it's kind of funny to think of it at the time, but he gave me a VHS tape, which was at the time was already old school. You know, this is 20 years ago when people were not using VHS tapes. But he gave me a VHS tape of an interview that Ayn Rand did with Phil Donahue in the 1970s. And I had never seen anything like it before. It was this old, pretty elderly by that time, Russian woman sitting in front of a pretty hostile audience being interviewed by someone who was fairly left-wing and providing these incredibly logical answers to the way she saw the world. And for me, it felt like being hit by a bolt of lightning. I'd never heard anyone speak like that. And so I became very curious about, firstly, you know, Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivism. And then my friend also gave me a VHS tape of Milton Friedman, and you know, famous economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And then that started me on a journey of trying to understand economics, which was, you know, something that I spent many years just poring over economics papers and textbooks so that I could understand economics, because I realized it was a very powerful tool to understand how the world works. And so I first came across Milton Friedman. I read, you know, everything I could about him and his book, Free to Choose, and various things that he had written. And then I discovered the Austrian school of economics, because I was trying to find criticisms of Friedman to sort of, you know, battle test his ideas and see what people were saying he had gotten wrong. And all of the criticisms that I heard from left-wing economists felt very weak. They didn't feel like very coherent, logical criticisms. But then I came across the Austrian school and people like Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises, and they were criticizing Friedman from the other direction, and those criticisms actually resonated with me. And so I got very interested in Austrian economics and the history of Austrian economics and the methodology of Austrian economics. And so I, you know, had spent a few years at Google really doing a deep dive on Austrian economics. And then I became very interested in gold for two reasons. One is like, sort of historically, Indians have been very big buyers of gold and have been very interested in gold as an investment, and in weddings they give gold as a dowry and as a gift. And so there's this kind of ancestral connection. But then I was really interested in the economic question, like, why does gold have any value? It's not used for anything. I mean, for the most part, it's not used for anything. Now there's some de minimis use for electronics and, you know, dental fillings and stuff like that. But historically, gold wasn't really used for, it didn't have any industrial purpose. And there was this kind of debate inside Google. There was a mailing list to debate various ideas on economics. And a lot of people would say gold is useless. I mean, and they would give this Warren Buffett quote of like, if aliens saw the human race digging up a shiny rock in one place and then burying it in another place, they would think we're absolutely crazy and like irrational. And I thought, well, that sounds superficially like a good explanation for why gold is useless. But the more I dug into it and the more I applied the tools of Austrian economics, I realized actually gold has a very important use, which is money. And it was money for most of human history, most of civilized human history. And I tried to understand why. And it wasn't acting as money anymore, right? We don't go to the grocery store and buy bread and milk with gold. So sure, it had values money in the past, but why does it still have value? And it has a lot of value. It's worth trillions of dollars. And I spent, a lot of time thinking about that question. It's kind of weird to say because I was an engineer, and why would an engineer be thinking about this? But for some reason, I was obsessed with this question. And anyway, so I was at Google, and then this fellow comes to visit Google to give a talk. It was the 2007 primary campaign for the presidential election, and the Republican Party was trying to choose a candidate. And this fellow comes, Ron Paul, and he talks about stuff that I'd never heard any politician talking about before, the importance of sound money and why the US should be on a gold standard. And I was just really blown away by not just that these ideas felt very new to me and the fact that it was a politician talking about them, but he had that same quiet poise of being able to explain things from a place of conviction that had come from understanding the world that Ayn Rand had had. And so I found that very attractive. And I quit my job at Google and said, I want to do whatever I can to help get you elected. And so I left to New Hampshire and I raised millions of dollars, and I knocked on a lot of doors around the state. And ultimately, it didn't succeed. He was not the nominee for the Republican Party. And I learned that the political process is actually very manipulated, and that there are these very powerful interests which control it. And the media is one of them. And at the time, there was a debate for the New Hampshire, before the New Hampshire primary, and Fox just excluded Ron Paul completely and said, "You're not in the debate. We don't want you to be in the debate." And that effectively killed his chances. And so I realized that, if the media doesn't like you, they can kill your chances. And that felt really unfair to me. And I realized all of this grassroots effort that I'd gone to, bringing volunteers to the state, knocking on doors, that was really insignificant compared to these powerful interests like the media. And so I became very dejected and decided I don't want to be involved in politics ever again. I'm going to ditch this and I'm going back to technology. And that's what I did. And I did, a bunch of startups, and I got exposed to Bitcoin in 2011. So 3 years after I'd done the campaign for Ron Paul.
Yeah.
And it was just happenstance. I'd been interested in economics, and I liked thinking about it. And I had a friend who was also interested in economics, and we had a bet about whether the Federal Reserve would increase interest rates. And I won the bet, and the bet was for a single silver coin, which was, a 1 ounce silver coin at the time was worth $50. And my friend, who's one of the best investors I know, told me not to take silver, that he wanted to pay me this other thing, this other type of money that he thought was much better than silver. And he explained it to me a little bit, and I didn't understand. And he said, "You need to download some software." And I was like, "Why?" And so I downloaded the core software, and it started downloading the blockchain. And it was on a really, terrible small laptop, an Asus laptop, $200 laptop. And the laptop started getting really hot. And I was like, "What's going on?" And it was verifying all the transactions on the blockchain. And that, I know, it took an hour or two. And then my friend showed me how to create an address. And then he sent me 5 Bitcoin. The price of Bitcoin was $10 at the time. So 5 Bitcoin was the same value as the silver coin that he owed me. And he showed me on a block explorer, a very, very primitive block explorer, which was just flat HTML with addresses and balances. So it was just letters and numbers. And I had no idea what was going on. And it wasn't like a lot of money or anything. So I was just like, okay, whatever. And I forgot about it. I completely forgot about it. I forgot about the wallet. I forgot, that there was any Bitcoin on the laptop. And I had a girlfriend at the time who I broke up with later on, and she needed a laptop. So I gave her my laptop. And so it had those 5 Bitcoin on it. at some point I realized, like when Bitcoin in 2017 started going up, I realized that the laptop was worth a lot of money. Like when Bitcoin got to 5,000, I was like, man, that laptop is worth like 25,000. And then Bitcoin got up to 10,000 and then 20,000. I was like, damn, that laptop's worth a lot. So I emailed her and asked her if she still had it, and unfortunately she did not. She had lost the laptop in a hotel in Minnesota, and she was obviously telling the truth. You can see on the blockchain those bitcoins have never moved, so those bitcoins are dead. And the total supply of bitcoins is 21 million minus at least 5. And of course, we know that many other bitcoins have been lost in this way. And the reason for that is most of us in the beginning, in the early days, did not understand what we had. We did not understand this was an incredibly revolutionary technology. I say it's the most important innovation to money in 1,000 years. I mean, you think of the big innovations to money, like promissory notes and the minting of coins, and various innovations that have happened. I think Bitcoin is the most important innovation. But we didn't understand that. Most of us didn't understand that when we first came across Bitcoin. We're like, oh, this is kind of a cool technology, internet project. Maybe we can use it as a payment system. There was some libertarian potential to it, which is what attracted a lot of us. Like, maybe we can do anonymous payments and no one can control who we send to. And then, of course, Silk Road came along and there was this online anonymous drug market. But most of us didn't realize this is just better money. This is a much, much better version of gold. And it took me several years to figure that out.
Yeah, it's such a cool story, and I think it's cool to hear. Well, cool and not cool, I guess, because of the lost Bitcoin, but it's really interesting to hear about those early Bitcoin stories. Because yeah, like you said, right? I think especially in 2011, Bitcoin being worth $10, you're not really going to probably give much consideration to something that's $10, and okay, you have $50 of it. It's like having 50 euros or dollars in your wallet. But I'm curious, and like at what point, so it seems like between 2011 and 2016, 17, if I'm not mistaken, you kind of left it in the background and then noticed that through also a bit the price, of course, going up, that it kind of came back to mind. Is that kind of what happened, or at what point did you start to go from, oh, okay, well, this is cool, you know, I'm receiving it from my friend? Because you obviously, I think you had the perfect mix of the computer science background, so obviously being really well versed in technology, but then also the libertarian Austrian School of Economics background. So you had like the perfect, I would say, combination to really understand Bitcoin, right? So at what point did it go from being like, oh, okay, this is interesting, could be useful, to, oh wow, okay, we have something here?
Yeah, that's a great question. No one's asked me that before, but I think there was at least a few months where I didn't pay attention. I think I started paying attention in 2012, and I think in 2012 I became interested in the question of like, wait a second, the value is going up. Why is it going up? And then I got back to the question that I had asked about gold. Why does this have any value? And in fact, the question was even more striking than with gold, because gold, you could say actually you can use it for jewelry. A lot of people use it for jewelry, and there's some small amount of industrial use. But Bitcoin, there really was no other use at all. It's basically pure money. And most economists, even as Austrian economists at the time, said you can't create money out of thin air. There has to be some pre-existing demand for the money to sort of bootstrap the value up. A commodity use, and this is the regression theorem, Ludwig von Mises' regression theorem of where money gets its original value. And so I was like, wait a second, this does have value and it is going up. And so I became very, very interested in like, what is a theory for why Bitcoin, what is an economic framework for thinking about the value of Bitcoin and where it's going? And I spent at least 2 years trying to figure that out. And I think by 2013, I realized there was something special about Bitcoin. And that's when I think I became pretty bullish on it, and there's this sense of regret. Like I could have realized that this was important when I first got it. And I didn't, and I lost those Bitcoins. And this is typical with Bitcoin. Like the biggest amount you can get is usually in the beginning, right? Like because it's much cheaper, and it's usually that first purchase or first gift which is the biggest chunk of your Bitcoin. But it took until 2012 before I was curious, and 2013 when the price was getting into hundreds of dollars and it was going up to 1,000, that I started becoming bullish. And I would say by 2014 I think I had most of the understanding that is written in my article, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, and which was later turned into a book. Most of the understanding I had by 2014. And there is a podcast I did, the first ever podcast. It was actually before the one I mentioned before we started with Stefan. The first one I did was in 2014, where I talk about most of the ideas in the bullish case for Bitcoin back then. And I've gone back and listened to that like maybe a couple of years ago, and it holds up really well. I was like, yeah, I think I mostly understood what Bitcoin was about. And then by 2017, I had a lot of people asking me about Bitcoin because I had friends and family who knew that I, for a long time, had been really interested in Bitcoin and spent a lot of time studying it. And so I thought, well, I need to write this down somewhere because it will be much easier for me to share a link with my friends and family than to sit on the phone with them for half an hour and explain why Bitcoin is a big deal and answer the same questions over and over again. So I started writing the bullish case for Bitcoin at the start of the bull market when Bitcoin crossed 1,000. I think it was January 2017. And we just had our first child, and I was working a job, so I was really busy. And it took me a year to write it. And unfortunately, I published it after the bull market had ended. It was the beginning of the bear market. And so it was published in early 2018. That's kind of the timeline of how I got interested in Bitcoin and how long it took me to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the craftsmanship of well, now it's a book, but at the time it was an article because, we were talking a bit before we went on air that The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, which is the article that you ended up publishing, was super influential for me in my early part of my journey because of how simple yet detailed it is in terms of explaining the value proposition of Bitcoin. And, hearing you saying that, I mean, obviously you were, like you said, managing a newborn, another job, but the fact that it took you, a year to refine it and post it, I think speaks to how valuable the article is. And when you did end up releasing it, you kind of mentioned that the initial motivation was that, you didn't want to have to keep repeating yourself and explaining Bitcoin over and over again. But what was the initial reaction to the article by the public? And did you ever expect that it would get to, the magnitude that it did?
No, I was shocked. I was completely shocked because the motivation, as I said, was like, this is for friends and family. And then, I mean, it immediately got a lot of attention and was read, by, I think the first couple of days or weeks, it was up to like 100,000 people had looked at it. And now it's over 1 million. And then I started getting all these requests from people to translate it. Like, oh, this would be really great for our community in Brazil or in Spain. And then people would say, like, I want to translate this. And people volunteered to translate. It's been translated into over 20 different languages around the world. And yeah, I was just still blown away. And whenever people tell me that it was a part of their Bitcoin journey, it's really humbling because it's like, I think Bitcoin is incredibly valuable and it is going to help a lot of people around the world get financial freedom. So it's just so cool to hear that people have read it and it helped Bitcoin click for them. Like, they didn't get it before they read the article, and after they read the article, they're like, oh, now I understand. Why does this have any value? And why has the value been going up? And it's in the context of what money is, because most people don't think about money. They don't think about where money gets its value. They just kind of take it for granted. Like, I get paid a salary in money, and then I can use my money to buy stuff, and money seems to hold its value over time. And some people who've given some thought to it might understand inflation and money losing its value over time. But really, most people don't have much of an understanding of money. And I think that was the big focus on the article, which is, well, what's money? Where does it come from? Why does it have value? And what makes for good money? And when you understand those things, then Bitcoin makes complete sense. Then you're like, oh, I get it. This is just better money. And there are specific reasons why it's better money that you can enumerate and understand. And when you use Bitcoin, it's very clear why it's better money.
Yeah, and I think, well, because the article was, like I said, it's detailed without being, I think it hits on exactly kind of the main concepts that you need to understand when you're coming into Bitcoin. I think now obviously it's been expanded into a book, so it goes into a bit more details. But even the article, I think, as I mentioned, it gives a great primer for people who don't understand, to really come into a better understanding of, okay, yeah, like you said, right? People don't often think about what is money, what makes money good, the different monies that we've also had throughout history. So I think all those things, in the bullish case for Bitcoin, it really made it clear. And I think because also part of the motivation with the show is to reach out to people who are in the beginning of their Bitcoin journey, just like I was when I read your article. So, I mean, I obviously recommend all of them to check out the article and the book, and I'll link all of that in the show notes. But I think what I wanted to do is have a brief conversation with you about, what makes a good money good and why it's also important to have a good money in society. I know that's a very loaded question, but I don't know if we can try to condense that a bit and give listeners who maybe aren't aware a bit of a overview of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing that people find difficult about Bitcoin is it's not like traditional financial assets, and it's hard to understand how to value it. Like, what value do you put on Bitcoin? When you have something like stocks, the way you value them is a discounted cash flow analysis. You look at how much cash flow they produce and how many dividends they're issuing, and then you kind of discount that by the interest rate, and that gives you a present value for the stock. And the same idea applies to bonds. Bonds produce interest, and it applies also to real estate. Rental property produces rent, and you can kind of figure out, like, what is the value of the rental property based on the rent. But Bitcoin doesn't have any cash flow. Gold doesn't have any cash flow. So why do they have any value? And the reason they have value is they serve the purpose of money in society, and all human societies, developed human societies, need money. If we don't have money, then we can't have a division of labor. We can't have people specializing in various things. Like, if you look at the societies that didn't have money historically, they were very primitive societies with very little trade, like small villages, and very isolated, and they didn't have much trade. Once you get to the point where you need to trade, you need something which allows people to hold value and to transact with each other in an indirect way. And the reason is, like, if I am someone growing apples and you're someone who's catching fish, and we want to trade with each other, you might not want apples, or I might not want fish at that exact moment. And so the trade won't happen, and this reduces trade-based wealth. But if we have something that we both value, like a gold coin, for instance, and I can sell my fish for gold, then I can use the gold to go and buy something else. And the person that I'm buying from may not want the fish, but they do want the gold. So having this kind of intermediary, which becomes a medium of exchange, as we call it, is a very powerful thing within a society. And And so then you come to the question of like, what makes for a good money? Like, what historically has been good as money in human societies? And there are certain properties that make for a good money. And these are pretty obvious when you think about them. One is divisibility. Like, it should be easy to divide because sometimes you want to do larger transactions, sometimes you want to do smaller. Like, sometimes you want to buy a car, sometimes you want to buy a loaf of bread. So you need money that you can divide. And this is actually why cows are not as good money as gold. You can subdivide gold fairly easily, but subdividing a cow is not an easy thing to do. Fungibility is another important property of money. Like, every unit of the money should be equivalent to every other unit. And so gold is better money than diamonds because diamonds are irregular in shape and quality. They're not all the same. So if you're trying to trade with diamonds, it's actually inconvenient because every time you get a diamond, you have to look at it and be like, oh, what's the quality of this diamond? Is it good enough to do the trade? Whereas gold is all the same. Like, one piece of gold is the same as any other piece of gold. So fungibility is another one. Portability, the ability to move the money, over geographical space is an important factor. Like, if you want to trade with someone who's in the next village, you don't want to carry something super heavy. And again, gold is useful because so much value, because it was so scarce, so much value can be condensed into a coin, and you can carry a coin a great distance. But probably the most important characteristic of a good money is scarcity. That is, it's not easy to produce. If it's easy to produce, then it's not good as money because people will go and produce it and then go and spend it, and you have massive inflation. So gold is better money than sand. If sand were money, we'd all run to the beach, we'd all get our buckets and we'd fill them with sand, and that would be money, and we'd start spending them, and then the money would kind of collapse very quickly because the value of it would drop because it can be obtained very, very easily. And so gold historically was money because it's incredibly difficult to produce gold. You have to mine it, and over time, the gold that's easy to mine, that's on the surface, is mined, and then it becomes increasingly difficult. And then you sort of get to today where if you want to mine gold, you have to dig massive mines, and it's incredibly costly to get even a small amount of gold. So gold has the property that it's very, very difficult to produce. It has that property of scarcity. So if you look at these attributes that make for good money: divisibility, portability, fungibility, scarcity, and there are some other ones that I list in my article, Bitcoin excels at all of these. It is superior to its competitors like fiat monies like the dollar, and superior to gold. And it for instance, I can send Bitcoin as easily as I can send an email. And I don't know exactly where you are right now, where you're living, but I could send you Bitcoin worth, $1,000 very easily. But if I wanted to send you gold, it would be very costly. I'd have to put it in a mailer. I'd have to insure it. It would take time to get to you. So Bitcoin has this portability thing that gold doesn't have. It's significantly superior to gold on that attribute. It's also better on scarcity because Bitcoin has a strictly limited supply of 21 million Bitcoins. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. Gold, even though it becomes harder and harder to mine, the supply of gold is constantly increasing by about 2% a year. So gold does have some inflation. So if you own a gold coin, the amount of gold you own relative to the total supply goes down over time. Whereas if you own one Bitcoin, you own a fraction of the total Bitcoin that will never go down over time. And so that's a really compelling idea. If you want to keep some savings in Bitcoin, you can never be debased. So along all of these attributes, Bitcoin excels, and it's the reason why people choose it at the margin as opposed to choosing gold or fiat currencies. They look at these attributes and they say, wow, this has perfect scarcity. I can send it to anyone around the world without anyone's permission. It's very easy to verify that it's legitimate. I have a real Bitcoin. Gold actually is difficult. If you get a gold coin, verifying that it's actually true gold and not tungsten, you need a spectrometer, which is an expensive piece of equipment, right? So Bitcoin is just better because it's better for the attributes that make for good money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate that explanation. I know it's I mean, you covered all the properties of money there, and I think yeah, for people who are new and are listening, I think understanding the properties of money and what makes money sound and money good, I think, and then kind of as you have also done in your example, kind of going and comparing that to how Bitcoin measures on these properties to other monies that we've had in the past, I think is a really useful exercise to understand. Okay, where does Bitcoin get its value, and why has it been so valuable for 15 years or more than 15 years now? One thing that's also interesting, and that you talk a bit about in the article and in your book, is about kind of the adoption of money and how money goes from a collectible to, well, depending how far along the spectrum it goes, to eventually like a global money. So in terms of, since you've been in Bitcoin, or were introduced to Bitcoin at least very, very early on in 2011, I'm curious a bit on your thoughts of where you see Bitcoin today in terms of an adoption perspective.
Yeah, you're referring to the evolution of money, which I talk about in my article. And the reason I brought that up in the article in my book was there was a big debate about, is Bitcoin money? Can it be money in the early days? And a lot of people believed that it wasn't money because it was not a medium of exchange. People were not going to the grocery store and using it to buy bread and milk. And the point I was trying to make in my article is that no money starts out as a medium of exchange. It goes through an evolution. And gold did not, even when it was money, it didn't start out as a medium of exchange. It took thousands of years to get to that point where it was used as a medium of exchange. All market-based monies start off as collectibles. That is something that people desire just because, on a whimsy, it's cool, or gold was a shiny rock, and we don't know why the first humans picked it up and liked it, but, it was a collectible. And then as more people sort of adopt it as a collectible, it becomes a store of value because you realize that other people in your community want that thing and they value that thing. And so by holding it, you're holding something that is valued in the future. Once it becomes held by enough people in that sense, it becomes a deeply established store of value. And then the value of it starts to plateau because everyone has some of it. The value is increasing as people adopt it and realize that, hey, this could be something that I should keep savings in. And when the value plateaus, it becomes suitable as a medium of exchange. And then people start using it to price other things in. So a sheep is like 3 ounces of gold, or a cow is 5 ounces of gold. And you start thinking of the price of other things in terms of that previously store of value, but becoming a medium of exchange. And then the final stage is a unit of account, when everything is priced in terms of that money. And every good, when you go to the grocery store, is priced in terms of, today it's in terms of dollars, or in Europe in terms of the euro. And that's the last stage of the evolution of money, is becoming a unit of account. Now, where Bitcoin is, I would say from its inception to, I don't know, 2017-ish, I would say it was still just a digital collectible. It was something that was valued by people who were ideologically aligned with the idea of freedom money and the ability to do anonymous transactions. And I think we're in the stage of Bitcoin becoming a store of value. I think we're still in the earliest part of that transition from being a collectible to being a store of value. And so I describe Bitcoin as an incipient store of value. It's becoming a store of value. It's not a deeply established store of value. I would say Bitcoin has become a deeply established store of value when it attains the same market capitalization of gold. And so Bitcoin's market capitalization now is about 1/10 of gold, about 10% of gold. So Bitcoin still has 10x to go before I would say this is a globally deeply established store of value. And so I think we're still pretty early in the journey.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I think, we are still very early in terms of, I think also, well, not just adoption, but I think also people understanding what Bitcoin is and how it, the value that it has going forward. In terms of its, further evolution, I think you're right. I think that gold target is something that a lot of people talk about in terms of, overtaking that and being priced accordingly. How do you see Bitcoin evolving into the future? I think also in terms of, because ideally also I think, well, we want to get to a point, or I guess it depends what your school of thought is, but where we can also use Bitcoin to pay for things. And, people are doing that already through things like the Lightning Network, and there's obviously a lot more innovation now in the space. But I think just in terms of like a global perspective, do you see Bitcoin evolving to becoming like a global reserve currency of the world, and then, maybe fiat currencies or stable coins or whatever being pegged to the value of Bitcoin? Or how do you see its further evolution going into the future?
Yeah, I do see that, Stefan, but I think that's a longer story. I think that's a multi-decade story. I think the most obvious path for Bitcoin over the next, say, 5 years is just the financialization of Bitcoin and the development of Bitcoin as a globally accepted store of value. And so that, I think the next 10x is the most obvious, like Bitcoin becoming entrenched as digital gold and the financial system accepting it as such. And we're really even there at the earliest stage, like the launch of the Bitcoin ETFs and various products that are being built by financial institutions to offer to their clients. Actually, I spoke to a major financial institution yesterday, and I spoke to the head of their digital asset strategy, and they're building out a huge platform over the next 3 years around Bitcoin and offering it to their clients. And they have millions of clients across the US and the world. And so the process of financializing Bitcoin and accepting it as legitimate and, within the regulatory framework, that process is going to take years. And as that happens, that's going to bring in a lot of demand from people whose net worth and wealth is in the traditional financial system. And then they're going to have access to Bitcoin. And these financial institutions are going to be promoting Bitcoin. They're going to be saying, you should have some of this in your portfolio because it's a great hedge against inflation. It's a great store of value. It has much more potential for growth than gold, enough potential to compete with equity market returns. We're really, when I speak to people in the traditional finance world, I feel like we're at the earliest stages of that journey. They're really only gotten to the point where they're like, okay, this is not going away, and there's a big profit opportunity for us. Let's build a platform around it. But that process is going to take years. So this financial institution that I was speaking to has a 3-year plan. And the first phase of this plan is just to get spot market access to their customers, which is the most basic product offering. And that, that could take 6 months or a year. But I just kind of want to emphasize that there is still a lot of demand and a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built out. And that's going to take several years to happen.
Yeah, and I appreciate that insight. And I think obviously a lot of times as Bitcoiners, we want to see the pace of progress go faster. But yeah, I think in order to get 8 billion people on board onto Bitcoin, I think there's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things that need to be built before we can do that. So, but yeah, I think it's exciting times. I think there's new developments coming out every day, whether that be big institutions entering the game, new developments, either startups or otherwise within Bitcoin. So it's an exciting time to be part of the Bitcoin industry. And I know we're short on time here, so I'm going to ask my last question that I ask all my guests on the show. And that is, given that we do have a lot of new people entering the space, what advice would you have for them?
The thing I hear most from people who are new to Bitcoin or curious about Bitcoin is, I'm too late. I feel like I'm too late. And I try to explain to people that I think Bitcoin still has 100x in it. So we've only seen 1% of the growth that Bitcoin is going to have. The other 99x, to get us to the rest of Bitcoin's potential is still in the future. So it's still such an early story. So I think it's such a great time to get some exposure to Bitcoin. I think the only portfolio allocation that makes no sense is zero. If you feel like it's risky, then maybe it's a 1% allocation for you, but you should have some allocation. And that usually spurs people to go and learn something about Bitcoin. And when they learn, their allocation sometimes increases. It goes from 1% maybe to 5%. And then Bitcoin does its thing. It naturally grows. And then suddenly they've got 20% of their portfolio in Bitcoin. And then they're very curious. Like, I should really understand this because it's a big chunk of my net worth now, and I want to understand it. And then they get strong conviction. And the sad thing is this process takes time, and Bitcoin's price doesn't wait for anyone. And so we talked about that in this podcast. I came across Bitcoin in 2011, and it took me years, literally years, before I felt like I understood it enough that I felt confident going out and investing in a serious way in Bitcoin. And all the while Bitcoin's price had gone up, I don't know, like 50x or something in that period. And so I think the right strategy is get some Bitcoin, then go and learn about it, and realize that we are still so early in this story.
Yeah, I love that. Great advice. And obviously also really recommend the article and the book for my listeners as a great starting point. And I don't say that because you're on the podcast. I say that because it was also very influential for me. So yeah, I appreciate all you do for the space. I'll also put everything in the show notes. But where can my listeners find you and find more about everything that you're doing?
Twitter is the right place. I mean, X, I still have this bad habit of calling it Twitter, but X is the right place to find me. I'm real_Vijay, so REAL_VIJAY. And I mostly talk about Bitcoin there and how I see the market evolving and just my views on how Bitcoin's going to change the world.
Awesome. Well, Vijay, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated the conversation, and I'm sure my listeners will as well.
Thanks, Stefan.